Hey everybody, Dr. G here. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and body language expert, and today we're going to be analyzing more behavior and body language from Christopher Gregor. Christopher Gregor is currently on trial for the murder of his son, Corey Micciolo. It's alleged that Corey died due to injuries sustained after being aggressively forced to run on a treadmill. Before we get started with this analysis, a couple of quick things. One, I wanted to remind you, this is not a psychological evaluation of any kind. These are just my opinions. In addition to that, the goal of this is not to prove his guilt nor his innocence. The goal is to provide commentary on his behavior and his body language. Last thing before we get started is I do want to remind you to like and subscribe if you want to see more content just like this. All right, let's go. We're going to be watching two different clips today. First, we're going to watch him reacting to Dr. Thomas Anderson, who's a forensic pathologist and expert in this case. After that, we're going to watch some of his body cam footage. He was pulled over 2 days after the death of his son, Corey. All right, let's just jump right in.
And did you review the autopsy report authored by Dr. Ragazzo?
I did.
And what other materials did you review to formulate the basis for your opinions?
So I'm not really going to be focusing much on Dr. Anderson, but I do want to point this out just because there is a lot of research on the way that people react to expert witnesses. In terms of his own body language, he is very open, he appears very comfortable, and that makes a huge difference for how juries are willing to accept information. So he will become more believable because he seems confident, because he seems open. I just thought I would point that out. We'll spend most of the time talking about Christopher Gregor, but I do think that his body language lends itself well to the way that juries will receive the information.
In addition to the autopsy report, I saw the images that were generated in association with the autopsy, and I examined...
Now this is interesting. Watch this right here. Now, this look right here is pretty much, if you've been watching the trial, this is pretty much his default look. He stares forward. He looks very intense. He doesn't move around a lot. So this is probably very familiar.
Were generated in association with the autopsy.
This, on the other hand, we think of this as being related to sadness. So the eyebrows pointing upward like this, and there's a flash of it very briefly as he's talking about the autopsy photos. Now, that doesn't mean that he necessarily is feeling sad for Corey. Could be feeling sad for himself because an expert is talking about this, but we are seeing a very brief flash of sadness. Let's go back and watch this in context.
To formulate the basis for your opinions.
In addition to the autopsy report, I saw the images that were generated in association with the autopsy, and I examined the histological slides, and we'll talk about those more.
So you see him moving his head down and looking down a little bit. Now, he's not somebody that moves around much, so it tends to be notable when there is something different. And right now, he doesn't look like he's looking or talking to his attorneys. It looks like that he is thinking about something. And when we see the head moving down like this, we typically associate that with losing confidence. So hearing this pathologist talk about these, hearing the forensic pathologist providing his expertise and his background, may be making him lose some confidence regarding how this is all going to go.
Histological slides, and we'll talk about those momentarily. The slides that you look at under the microscope. So I looked at that. And then I had medical records from 3 different hospital facilities.
So you can see, as he looks down, he's also tucking his chin in, looking at his eyes through the top. Now, I've talked about this in other videos. Oftentimes, the chin tuck is a way when you start to feel a little bit defensive. Now, his is very subtle, so it's possible that it's just the lack of confidence. It's just looking down. But now that he's looking back up again, he didn't move his head. He's keeping his chin low. So I think that's a defensive position. I think that he feels very threatened right now.
I believe it's County Medical Center and Jersey Shore Medical Center and South Ocean. I saw medical records from Ivy Pediatrics, which were Corey's pediatric care provider. Certainly I saw police documentation, law enforcement.
Now, I talked about this in the last video about Christopher Gregor, but his blink rate is incredibly slow. When he's sitting and staring and focused, he is just laser focused on something.
Ivy Pediatrics, which were Corey's pediatric care provider. Certainly I saw police documentation, law enforcement documentation. I saw some telephone records. I had access to a...
And can you explain to the jurors when you say cause of death, what does that mean?
Cause of death is,
You'll notice that right now that Christopher Gregor is looking at his attorneys. He's looking around. He is not actually looking at Dr. Anderson. And that's probably due to the fact that it feels too intense to look at Dr. Anderson right now. There's probably too many feelings around that, and it probably makes him lose a little bit of that feeling of control that he has been pursuing so much. Because if you watched my last video about Christopher Gregor, one thing that's very evident, regardless of whether or not you believe that he ultimately killed Corey, is he is someone who has an exceptionally high need for control. So when you have an expert who's talking about this, the intensity of looking at them when they're talking about their conclusions is going to be very, very difficult.
If you sustain any of these kinds of blunt impact injuries with sufficient severity, it could conceivably bring about your death if they were severe enough.
After reviewing the materials in this case, did you formulate a...
His ability to have a blank stare and be this intense is really remarkable. Everybody's a little bit different with how they present in court, but he's somebody that has such a high degree of control that as he sits and listens to this, he probably perceives it as a threat, which is why he's not blinking. When you think about the survival mechanisms within the body, many of our involuntary reactions are due to survival. And in a situation like this, where his future is literally on the line, you might see somebody who stops blinking. You might see them looking at somebody in a way that is this intense. So that probably explains some of his lowered blink rate during all of this, because he sees the doctor as a genuine threat.
opinion as to the decedent's manner of death?
I did.
And can you tell the jurors what your opinion is?
Corey's manner of death is homicide. While there are many, many, many causes of death, typically in forensic pathology.
By the way, if you have not actually watched this clip, I hate to interrupt right here, but he is really, really good at explaining what he does and his opinions on these things. So if you really want to have a compelling, or if you really want to watch a very compelling part of this trial, watch his testimony in its entirety. It really is quite good.
And doctor, did you review any blood work from the hospital?
Yes.
And did that impact your conclusions?
Yes.
And what about any post-mortem CT scans?
You see that looking down, that movement of the head down. Like I said before, loss of confidence seems to be about the only thing we're getting from him as this doctor testifies.
And what about any post-mortem CT scans? Doctor, did you make any findings regarding bruising on the decedent's body, which was significant in regard to your formulation of your opinion?
Well,
now this is subtle, but what I'm seeing right now is it looks like he has a look of disgust. With disgust, you see the bottoms of the mouth point down, you see the nose furrowed a little bit, and it looks like that right now he has a subtle look of disgust on his face.
Doctor, can you explain to the jury if there was any opinion or determination or findings that you made after review of the materials regarding blunt force trauma and CPR post-mortem?
One thing that's really interesting about Christopher Gregor, and we've seen this throughout the trial as well, and it's not as apparent here because he's moving his head a little bit, but oftentimes he will just move his eyes. He tries so hard to move so little, probably because of that strong need for control, that sometimes instead of looking over and actually turning his head, which he does occasionally, he'll just move his eyes. He's somebody who doesn't move or doesn't waste any energy that he doesn't have to. He sits very still and is very controlled. But with that, let's go ahead and move on to his body cam footage, because this is going to be a very different version of Christopher Gregor than you've seen otherwise, unless you've already seen this. So let's jump into that, and I'm going to give you some analysis of what I'm seeing. I want you to keep in mind, this was 2 days after the passing of Corey. I also want you to keep in mind you're not going to be able to hear it very well. I will clarify what's being said whenever I can. Let's jump right in. Now, you can tell this stance right here. This is a stance of compliance. So he's holding his wrist. He's got his hands in front of himself, standing up very straight. He's trying to show that he is going to comply. That's typically what we associate that body language with.
She would fly out. She's like, I'd like to be there with you on the drive back. I don't want to be alone. And I said, okay.
You've been dating her on and off again for 2 years and took you a second.
I mean,
Took you a second to figure out what thing.
I'm freaking out right now because there's like
I asked her.
stars.
Come on, bro. You graduated college.
I went to grad school too, and I was a math teacher. So you know I don't.
So what we're seeing right now is somebody's body language who's trying to connect with a police officer. He's leaving his body open. He's trying to be casual, but he's also leaving his arms down low.
I just like those that can't do teach. Whatever.
So he just said something about those who can't do teach. I guess he's trying to be funny, and then he covered himself back up again. So he does have some discomfort here. He tried to be open, he's trying to connect, and he's not so sure how it's going, so he's closing back up again.
Like those that can't do teach, whatever. I mean, it's been an interesting past 2 years, to say the least.
When you say date, you can just like hook it up with it.
Not really.
So now you see him putting his hands on his hips. Now, oftentimes we do this as a way to dominate, to feel a little bit like we're taking up more space. It's also possible that he's trying to mimic the way that the police are standing. Police oftentimes stand this way. And I think that it's possible that he's mimicking that as well because he's trying really hard to connect right now. He's saying jokes. He's trying to be easy to get along with. He wants to be liked by the police officers right now.
Not really. She's met my son. She's met my son multiple times. I did. I just, like I said, I drew a blank. It's Laura Power.
So I asked her why she's here, what she was saying.
That she wanted to be here with me for the drive home. And she also might or might not say, because one of her main reasons was she didn't feel comfortable with me driving another 13 hours.
You also notice how much he's actually talking with his hands, which if you look at him during the trial, you might be surprised because he's so plain-faced during the trial. He stares so intensely. He shows very little emotion. And the fact that he's moving while he's talking, that does show some emotional connection to his body and to his body language.
After I've driven so much already. Because I haven't slept well, as you can imagine. So, it's just, I don't know. To be honest. I'm like numb at this point with everything going on in this now. I'm like a little freaked out. Because I don't know. My attorney didn't tell me everything's going on. So,
there's a lot of uncertainty in his body language. He's moving his hands up just a little bit. He's moving around. He's trying to leave himself open, but he seems really, really uncomfortable. And he even said he's freaking out a little bit right now. So I do think that he actually is feeling very uncomfortable in this moment, but he really wants badly to connect, and he keeps putting forth gestures to try to connect with the officer he's speaking to.
like I said,
That already, I'm talking to you.
and I mean, like I said, I think I said
We've
this to
already,
you.
we've had two things that don't add up just when you're reaching into the side.
And that's usually where I keep.
I do want to point out that this is 2 days after the passing of his son. Just unbelievable how casual he seems, how nonchalant he is about a lot of this. Like I said, he's uncomfortable, but I can't fathom being 2 days out from the loss of your son and this being the way that you're presenting. It's just unbelievable to me.
My wallet, and I didn't realize that it wasn't here. And I played football, so I might have CTE, short-term memory loss. I played outside one time.
So he says, I played football, so I might have CTE and short-term memory loss. So now that's where I start to think whether or not somebody's being manipulative. As soon as somebody feels the need to explain why they might have short-term memory loss or why they might have some reason that they're going to be inconsistent, that should always be a red flag to pay attention to.
I played football, so I might have CTE, short-term memory loss. I played outside one time.
See, what position did you play? So what this did was two things. It was a manipulation in the sense that he wanted to explain away any sort of inconsistencies that he might say, but he also is reaching out saying, I used to play football, which is a great way for a lot of men to connect. It's a way to have a follow-up question like, what position did you play? And that is a way to connect, because that's what I think that he's been trying to do this whole time, to try to relieve his anxiety, is to connect with somebody. So putting these things out there can be a manipulation in that sense.
D2 schools, NAIA, which is kind of like D2, it's in Lakeland, Florida, at Southeastern University, like a really Christian school. But yeah, I mean,
Playing against the baseball, I'm pretty good.
okay. But like I said, when I first got out of the car and you guys searched me,
So now he's starting to feel more comfortable, feeling like he got that connection. He's feeling more comfortable. I do think it's funny that he's casually dropping CTE as a possibility, that he has this consistent traumatic brain injury.
I apologize. I just made sure that, that
Make sure you didn't have like a grenade stuck in your pants.
exactly. But, if that was you, I apologize because I'm like tunnel vision. But I said, I don't mind if you guys search my vehicle at all. Like, there's nothing out.
But look at the difference here. So when he's talking to somebody, he's facing them, he's presumably looking at them, he's connecting with them. In the trial, he doesn't move. He sits there. He just moves his eyes. He moves as little as humanly possible. So that makes it seem like his behavior during the trial is largely intentional. He may not want to show body language.
I'm really not, so I'm not worried.
We'll get to that very soon, man. So, we're the same side and trying to figure everything out while we're doing all this, so.
Sure. I imagine that you guys would know if there was a warrant associated with that.
So right now he's asking about whether or not there's possibly a warrant. A little bit difficult to hear once again, but that does speak to how he's thinking right now. And we see this oftentimes over and over again with people in these situations. They start to fish for information. They start to ask whatever they can to get as much information as possible. Nothing inherently wrong with that, but we do see people in these situations doing more of that.
Regret ever.
So as the conversation continues, you can see this position right here, the holding of the elbow. This is oftentimes a sign of feeling awkward. This is where he's starting to feel uncomfortable, or continuing to feel uncomfortable, I should say. And he's sort of awkwardly standing there holding his elbow like this. This is just a sign of discomfort. Essentially, in a social situation, you feel like you can't leave. We'll go ahead and stop right here. Hopefully this is helping you better understand some of the body language that we're observing, as well as contrasting that with some of the body language that we're seeing while he's on trial. This has been just such an unspeakably sad case that I'm definitely not going to miss it when it finally wraps up. It's just an unbelievable loss of life and an unbelievably tragic loss of Corey. If you have any other thoughts or there's anything you want me to analyze from this trial, please let me know in the comments below. Last thing before we get finished up is I do want to remind you to like and subscribe if you want to see more content just like this. All right, thanks for watching.